Hello, everyone. It's Jeff back with you again with another episode of my Top 100 Albums list. The albums today that will be covered will be numbers 50 through 41. All right, so let's get right to it, shall we, with number 50 on CD. I don't have this on vinyl, maybe someday. It's Siamese Dream by the Smashing Pumpkins. And this album makes the list for a couple of reasons. Not only because of the music, which I like, but it's one of those records that encapsulates a certain time period and reminds me of a certain point of my life. This album came out in the fall of '93, I believe, and it carried over into '94 as their hits made it through the radio. And it was also a point where I had graduated college and my life took a hard 180, and I started a new job at a chemical plant, and they worked 12-hour swing shifts. So it was either 6A to 6P or 6P to 6A, and you bounce back and forth like every week, or almost every week. Yeah, I did that for 4 years, and I probably aged my body about 10. I don't recommend working those 12-hour shifts every single day. So whenever I hear a song like Today, or Disarm, or Rocket, or Cherub Rock, I always get that little tweak in the back of my mind about that part of my past. So I'm not the biggest Pumpkins fan. I mean, this is the only album that I have by them. They've done they've done some other stuff that I've liked, but nothing quite so much that was concentrated on a whole album as this one. I'm not really a big fan of Billy Corgan's vocals, but his songwriting and his musicianship is pretty solid. So number 50, we've got Siamese Dream by the Smashing Pumpkins. Someday I'd like to have this on vinyl. I know this was reissued on vinyl, and the cover is like purple or something. They made this picture purple, but for now, my OG copy from '93 will still do. It still sounds good. At number 49, sometimes you have to go all the way back to the beginning, and find out where where a lot of this music came from. And Robert Johnson, King of the Delta Blues Singers, is my pick for number 49. I became these are just liner notes on the back cover here. I became mildly obsessed with Robert Johnson in high school. That's when I bought this record, and I kind of just delved into his music for a period there late in my high school career, and just to learn more about his music and listen to these tracks, and it's good stuff. I mean, there's a reason. This music is popular, and it may not have started completely with Robert Johnson, but I know Robert Johnson helped make it famous, and so many songs of his ended up getting covered later in the '60s that I just wanted to hear the originals. So this is probably another must-have for any rock blues collection. I think there was another. Don't think this was the only collection of his songs that were released, but this is the one I've got. So number 49 is Robert Johnson, King of the Delta Blues Singers. At number 48 is a album by one of my, well, not one of my favorite bands. I like them pretty well. You gotta love the Kinks, right? So this is Lola versus Power Man and The Money Go Round is the full title. But I'm sure most all of you know the title track, Lola. It's kind of a funny story about this album. When I went to that, this is just showing you all the stuff here. Here's the gatefold with all of the lyrics and all of the pictures. When I'd gone to that awesome estate sale that I've talked about before, I almost had my hand on this album as I was flipping through boxes. And I picked it up and I was looking at it, and a guy comes up to me and he goes, "Hey, you gonna get that?" And at the time I'd already had a stack about this thick of records. So I was like, nah, I don't know. So I put it back, and I was kicking myself ever since. So I ended up having to get this elsewhere. Could have had this for $1, but stupid Jeff didn't take it. Oh well. As far as the music goes, I love the Kinks. I only have this album and I think Low Budget. Those are the only actual albums of theirs that I own. But I know the Kinks kind of have an odd history, and their records should have sold much more than they actually did. They should have been much more famous than they were. They should have been like, Stones level popular to me. But this album, front to back, is a really solid, tight collection of songs. Lola, of course, is the big hit. Ape Man is probably the other song that you may have heard on FM radio. But, yeah, Ray Davies has a singular ability of writing quirky songs. So at number 48 is Lola. At number 47, this is the album that I just played all the way through before I made this video in order to refresh my memory on it a little bit. And I posted a picture of it on Facebook too. It's Fleetwood Mac, Black Magic Woman. And this is a reissue collection of Fleetwood Mac's first two albums, Self-Titled and English Rose. So it's a double album. And this is Peter Green era Fleetwood Mac. Here's the... And yes, this came from a radio station, WRUV-FM. I think this was a radio station in Vermont. So like this cover opens up, and on the inside you can see the original lineup of the Peter Green era band. You've got Danny Kerwin and Jeremy Spencer, I believe, were also in the band at this time, with Peter and Mick Fleetwood and John McVie. These guys were just a straight-up blues band at this time, and the songs kind of alternate between, lots of slide guitar, fast-paced blues rock, and some of the slower ballads and stuff like that. Well, not really ballads, but just like blues crawls, I guess. But I also have a collection called Fleetwood Mac The Early Years, which also covers a lot of this stuff, and I think a couple of albums after this too. But yeah, I put this on when I got up today, and I ran it all the way through both albums, and I feel great. It's the cover looks like it's in crappy shape, kind of, but the records are pretty minty. So I'm a lot more forgiving on cover condition than I am on records, so I don't care if it looks like this. I mean, it's in decent shape. It's got some issues, but I guess if it came from a radio station, they must have never played it because this thing looks pretty dang new. Yeah, like I said before, I know the self-titled Fleetwood Mac from the 70s was further down on my list, and this version of Fleetwood Mac is a completely different band. I mean, besides, Mick Fleetwood and John McVie, it's a completely different cast, completely different sound from the stuff they did in the 70s. So that's why I'm putting another Fleetwood Mac album in my top 100, because this stuff is really good. And Fleetwood Mac purists will tell you that the Peter Green era is every bit as good as the later stuff, even though it probably, well, of course it didn't sell as many copies. But for my money, for white boy blues bands, white boy British blues bands, you really can't get much better than these guys in the 60s and probably into the very early 70s. So yeah, Fleetwood Mac Black Magic Woman is my number 47 album. Great stuff. I love that album. At number 46 is another CD. This is one I would really love to have on vinyl someday. Oates by Beck. Beck is one of those artists. Let me move this a little closer so you guys can see. Beck is one of those artists that I always have followed, since this album came out, and, well, even before with that song Loser. And he always seems to do interesting things with his albums. There's always interesting bits to them, and this one here is one that I've listened to thousands of times. And it still sounds fresh today, as it did in the 90s. This came out in, what, 94? No, 96, I'm sorry. So, yeah, Beck is one of those interesting guys. He's one of those artists that, I don't have all of his albums, but it seems like whenever I do go back and pick up his stuff, it's always like, oh wow, that's really cool. That's kind of what happens when I listen to Beck albums. So this is my number 46 album, Oates by Beck. At number 45 is by an artist that I may end up seeing in concert because he's doing his Farewell Yellow Brick Road tour. And this is Elton John's Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. I originally owned this on cassette. I think I bought it on cassette like in the early 90s. And it's front-loaded with a lot of the hits. I mean, it's a double album, and the first side is almost all radio hits. But when you dig deeper, it folds out in threes like this. Here we go, with all of the song titles and lyrics and what have you. But when you dig deeper into this album, this is really a very adventurous and deeper album than just, Benny and the Jets or the title track. Of course, probably it's up there as my favorite Elton John song of all time, the leadoff track, Funeral for a Friend / Love Lies Bleeding. It all kinds of blends into one. Is just a great, great song with a long instrumental build-up before Elton starts singing. And yeah, this was at that time in his career where he was just on fire. Him and Bernie Taupin were just cranking out hit after hit, great song after great song, great album after great album. And if I had to pick just one, I don't know if this is going to be the only Elton album on my list, but for number 45, this seemed like a good place to put it, so I'm putting Goodbye Yellow Brick Road by Elton John on my list. And if I'm lucky, maybe I'll get tickets to see that show, because my wife has seen Elton John several times. I never have. And since this is supposedly his farewell tour, which it very well could be, I mean, the guy I think is in his 70s now. You got to see these old rock stars before they retire for good or leave us for good. So who knows? Maybe it'll happen. At number 44 is an album that was also kind of a hard left turn for this artist. I'm talking about Santana. This is called Caravanserai. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right. If you only know Santana from their first 3 albums, and there's nothing wrong with that, believe me. You know, if you only know them by, Evil Ways, Black Magic Woman, and stuff like that, give this album a listen. This is kind of where, this came out after Santana 3, I believe. This was the next album to come out. Just show you the gatefold. You can see Carlos Santana was definitely moving in a more spiritual direction with his music. And the back cover just becomes one big long picture here, as you can see. His music definitely went in a more spiritual direction, and he started edging into like fusion territory, even, I would say. Besides this album, he made an album with John McLaughlin called Love, Devotion, Surrender. And he also made an album with Alice Coltrane called Illuminations, which I really like. And that was the album that inspired me to track down that solo Alice Coltrane album, Universal Consciousness. Bad move. Very bad move. Sorry. And I forgot what I was going to say now. Yeah, this was kind of the beginning of a very interesting period in Santana's musical career. Sales probably tanked. There's really no hit off this album. But as a whole, as a musical statement, this is a fantastic album. It's very atmospheric. Like I say, it's got that mood to it, with Carlos Santana's guitar over the top. The music is kind of mystical sounding and almost cosmic. And he stuck with this for the next several albums. And there may be another Santana album popping on this list. I haven't decided yet. But I wanted to make sure to at least talk about this album. So for number 44, Caravanserai by Santana, it showcased a definite turn in his music, which I find more interesting sometimes, just because, I haven't heard it 20,000 times on classic rock radio. So discovering albums like these that didn't sell, it's like rediscovering the artist. I had that with Bob Seger, a lot of the early Bob Seger albums, which never gets played on the radio. And it's like discovering a whole new artist. So yeah, check this album out. If you have any interest at all in Santana, I highly recommend this album. Caravanserai, I think it's called. Okay, for number 43, I need to take a drink of water. And I'll try to keep things moving along. We're closing in on 20 minutes. Is my favorite solo Beatles album. And I think it's a lot of other people's favorites too. All Things Must Pass by George Harrison. This was kind of like George Harrison's explosion, his solo blow up into the musical world, because after having been held back for so many years on Beatles albums, only getting one or two cuts per album, because John and Paul, which, I mean, you can't really blame them. I mean, when you've got two genius songwriters, it's kind of hard not to let them take up all of the territory. But towards the end of the Beatles' career, George had definitely found his songwriting knack, and the last couple of songs that he did for the Beatles, you know, carrying over into this album, are every bit as good as the stuff John and Paul were doing at the same time period. So this is a triple album. The third album is kind of like a big jam session, which isn't necessarily essential to your listening. But the two albums proper, co-produced with Phil Spector, has that great kind of wall of soundish sound to it, you know, with mixed in with George's sensibilities. And there's one thing I want to say. I'm not going to go too far into it, but as far as pressings go, this one here is a orange Capitol label reissue from the mid-70s. And if you come across these later pressings, I find, unless you're a total slave to, you know, having to have a first pressing or having to have an Apple label record, which I totally understand, but if you come across, you know, a later pressing like this one, don't be shy in buying it, because this sounds absolutely fantastic, even though it's not, you know, an Apple label pressing, or not a first or even second pressing probably. But yeah, this is, like I said before in other videos, it took a while for me to really warm to George, but the older I get, it seems like the more that his music speaks to me as a solo artist than, like, say, John. So my number 43 album here is All Things Must Pass by Joel Chiverson. The last two albums on this list are both greatest hits collections. I don't know if that's violating some kind of law for these lists, but it's my list, so I'm doing it anyway. I've shown this one a couple times before. I had to put Hall & Oates on my list. This was actually the first album I ever got, the first new album that I didn't inherit or wasn't one of my mom's and dad's. This is like the first album I got. So I had to put it in here at number 42. Rock and Soul Part 1 by Hall & Oates. Have been a fan of theirs since the early 80s, and I'll be a fan of theirs till the day I die. Daryl Hall is probably one of the best male singers around still. And this greatest hits package is pretty much all you need. I mean, there's a few songs that would be nice to all if would have been nice if they included it, but, you know, there's other greatest hits collections out there for these guys. But I had to put this in. Big Hall & Oates fan, so number 42, Rock and Soul Part 1. And finally, at number 41 is another greatest hits collection by Squeeze. Singles, 45s and under. Song for song, track for track. I'll put this up against any greatest hits collection because there is not one bad song on this album. It is literally all killer, no filler. When someone says that, you know, you try to think, yeah. But no, in this case, it really is all killer, no filler. And you can see, if you're familiar at all with Squeeze's songs, you can just look at that track list and go, yeah, he's right. These guys were on fire in the late 70s, early 80s. And while I could have picked, you know, one of their original albums. I just went with this greatest hits collection because, you know, it encapsulates that whole era up to like 1982, I believe. And I mean, as every song goes by, you're just like, man, that's a really good song. It's really catchy. You know, the lyrics are kind of quirky. The music is punchy. It's these guys know how to make a good song. So yeah, I went with this as my number 41 album. Squeeze, singles 45s and under. This is usually you can find this album relatively cheap, or at least in my area. I usually almost always see this album whenever I flip through the bins at, like, say, a half price. So this should be able to be found fairly easily for a decent price. And if you ever do come across this album and you don't have any experience at all with this band, give it a try. This is a really tight, great album, even though it's a greatest hits. And there's nothing wrong with greatest hits albums, as far as I'm concerned, because you get all the best stuff on them, all in one place, right? Okay, guys, that's it. We are slowly getting to the end. We are slowly climbing the ladder. And if you made it all the way to the end of this video, thank you. Thank you for watching. Thank you for commenting. Thank you for subscribing. And I will be back soon, hopefully, to talk to you about more records, even more records. All right. Peace, everyone. I'll talk to you soon. Take care.